Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome along to today's sunny afternoon Geddes lecture from the RTPI. Today we'll be discussing shaping a new normal with a wellbeing economy and looking at the role of place and planning. And I am absolutely delighted to have the lovely Katherine Trebeck joining me today to lead us in that conversation and to share her expertise and her hopes for us at a time when we're very focused on what could be a new normal for our economy, far more than perhaps 6 months ago. So I'm absolutely delighted about that. We're also joined later today by Sue Manns, President of RTPI Scotland, of RTPI UK, who'll be giving a vote of thanks later on also. I am Irene Buteman. I'm convener of RTPI Scotland in 2020. Part of being convener this year has been the absolute change of what I was anticipating was going to happen over the course of the year, and the fact that we have even today an online version of the Geddes lecture. What that means is we have about 300 sign-ups and people still joining. I can see the list going up as I'm talking. So in order to manage that over the course of the next hour, what we'll do is, as you're joining, your camera and your audio will automatically be switched off. I'm afraid it's just myself, Katherine, and Sue that you'll be hearing from. Questions, we will have a spell for a Q&A session, I'm delighted to say, and if you have any questions, then you can see on the right hand side where you have a control panel, there's a box there for questions, and if you can write those in, then we will get to that point and I will put the questions to Katherine. Apologies, but with the numbers that we've got on the line, I think it will just be quicker and smoother for us to do it like that rather than have folks chatting, so hope everybody's okay with that. We will close at 5 and then everyone can get out into the sun, or maybe you're there already, I don't know, that might be a nice way of listening in. So as I say, what a year. And here we are online having our Geddes lecture. It's been quite a spotlight. It's been a tough time for people, particularly those impacted by the virus, but it's really put a spotlight on how we work and working more online, but a big spotlight on our outcomes as well, and bringing things like this topic today very much to the fore. And that matches in brilliantly with having this conversation at the Geddes lecture. For those of you joining us who are not planners, Patrick Geddes is known as the father of town planning. He went to Perth Academy, as did I. That's where the similarities stop, but I like to get that one in. But he wasn't just a town planner. He was a biologist, a socialist, a geographer, a philanthropist. The guy did not work in a silo. He had a broad realm of knowledge, and that is fantastic. He introduced the idea of working around regions and thinking a little bit bigger about what was happening in areas and how that impacted on people. And he was very much about social observation and how place impacted on people. And I think for me, that's what appeals to the Geddes lecture, is that this is always seen as an opportunity for us to lift our heads when we're looking at places and think about that bigger picture and how it's as pertinent what he was saying back in the early 1900s as it is today, and even more so given what we're going through at the moment. For myself, those of you who know me know that place is what I'm about. It's impact on people and their daily choices. So that's social impact on people and how it can have that huge impact on our habitual choices, what we do when we step out our front door. And I would like to think, don't even know that it's been shaped in a manner that can help us to reduce carbon emissions, that can help us to increase health and well-being in our country and how long we live in good health, that can help us to build and feel we're part of a community rather than socially isolated, and ultimately can also help us with how much pound we've got in our pocket at the end of the month and how much we're spending on travel and other aspects of daily life. So we're pulling together around what is that role of place, what is that role when it comes to a well-being economy. And for me, place and all of its environments, be it physical, economic, digital these days, and the environment, all comes together in a place. And when we talk about planet and people, that's where well-being comes in. So it's all about that place and well-being aspect. So I was already into all of that and very enthused by all of that when Catherine's book came out earlier last year, and was busy reading that when the prospect of knowing that we had this lecture coming up came into view. So at that point I started, I don't want to say stalking Katherine. I didn't. I followed you on Twitter. And enjoying, and I encourage any of you who are listening in today and want to continue to certainly follow Katherine. But also then I had the opportunity at the end of last year to go along to a book reading and to meet Katherine and to ask her if she would consider coming along and talking today, and I'm delighted to say that that she's accepted, and here she is. So a little bit of background just on who you are, Katherine. I've been checking your CV with a PhD in political science from the Australian National University. You're Scotland's gain that you're here living and working, delighted that you are. And working in advocacy and influencing for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. And I encourage any of you following on from this to have a look at that website. There's a massive resource there, and on Katherine's website, that I am using all the time at the moment. It's really great, so I really encourage you to look at that. Prior to that, Katherine was leading in Oxfam on a human economy, and as I said, was the author of The Economics of Arrival with Jeremy Williams as well. Before I hand over to Katherine, I have one final thing I'd like to say, which is whenever I'm asked to talk about something, I tend to look up the definition of it. And I looked up the definition of economy, and there were two there. One was the production and consumption of goods and services and the supply of money. It didn't say anything about the quantities of that being good or bad, just that that's what it was. And the second was the careful management of available resources. And I think when we take the two of those in a whole, we can start to maybe think about a different economy. So many conversations about doing that at the fore now, that this today is a perfect time to have that conversation. So enough from me. I shall hand over to Katherine for her reflections and experience and her hopes for a new normal. Over to you, Katherine. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Irene. Thank you, and thanks everyone at the RTPI team for making this happen, and for everyone who is foregoing the beautiful afternoon that we've got here in Scotland to join this. So I really am looking forward to chatting with you afterwards. I'm going to speak for a little while, but really looking forward to the questions and conversations afterwards. And I want to start with an observation about this current economic system that we found ourselves in. This observation was, it's not intelligent, and I think that's a fair shout if you think of how much effort and expenditure we have to invest in helping people pick up the damage from the economic system, whether that's trying to reduce inequalities or handing out food parcels, or even in-work tax credits and so on, and cleaning up after environmental messes. And really prior to COVID, this wasn't an intelligent economic system. It's not beautiful, and you only have to look at the damage that we're doing to the environment to see that it's not just. And again, you only need to look at just how unequal our economic system is and how many people are still struggling to eke out a living while others make great wealth. It's not virtuous, and it does not deliver the goods. And the person making this observation carried on, and they said, in short, we dislike it and we're beginning to despise it. But then when we wonder what to put in its place, we are extremely perplexed. Now, this was actually John Maynard Keynes writing in 1933. And I think now, almost 100 years on from when Keynes penned those words, we actually do know what to put in its place. There's a wide movement, the Wellbeing Economy movement, or a whole lot of cousin concepts, if you like, of scholars and activists and pioneers and practitioners who are rolling up their sleeves and creating, perhaps in microcosm, an economic system that is much more about putting human and ecological well-being to the fore. And so I want to reflect really on where we are now, that if we take the time to recognize just the extent to which, prior to the COVID emergency, GDP is misaligned to what we really need, that the extent to which the UK and countries like the UK have actually got plenty of wealth and resources. The problem is not a lack or an inadequacy. It's our terrible extent to which we share things and the extent to which we don't cherish the resources that we've got. Then we can recognize this possibility of arrival that Jeremy and I talk about in the book that Irene talked about. And if we can embrace this idea that actually the journey of and the task of economic growth has been completed, we've arrived, that then enables us to begin a new task. And this is what we describe as making ourselves at home. And that is making the most of the wealth and resources, sharing and cherishing them better. And that's about building a wellbeing economy. Now, at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, we crowdsourced from our members some of the key components of what a wellbeing economy might entail, what we all need, if you like. And I'm going to share 5 of them with you. So firstly, it's about connection, a sense of belonging, and actually have our institutions set up to serve the common good. It's about participation, people being actively engaged, locally rooted economies rather than extractive economic models. It's of course about nature, not recognizing that nature is something we just take from, but actually we're all embedded in a natural ecosystem when we need a regenerated natural world. A wellbeing economy is of course about fairness, massively reducing the gap between richest and poorest and recognizing the need for justice in all its dimensions. And finally, a wellbeing economy is about dignity, making sure everyone has enough to live in comfort, ensuring that people get a sense of purpose. And these are the core elements of the wellbeing economy. That this is what our economic system needs to be purposed to deliver. And that's quite a shift in orientation and a shift in mindset, if you like. It's about moving away from celebrating and patting ourselves collectively on the back when we slightly redistribute the gap between rich and poorest. It's about moving away from celebrating when we've made an inhumane economic system slightly less inhumane, slightly humanized it. It's about saying we need to do better than that, better than simply fixing and healing and redistributing, to actually getting it right in the first place. And this is what I describe as getting the economy to do more of the heavy lifting. And some of the components of that are things like pre-distribution, essentially looking at how we design the market so that it yields more equal outcomes in the first place, embracing the foundational economy that certainly has come into its own in the COVID crisis, and recognizing that it's no longer good enough to not see in our prices the full cost of an economic activity, the extent to which so many business practices exercise their true environmental impact and hence over impact on the environment in a negative sense, and also perhaps under deliver on a social sense. And so there's some of the key components of the wellbeing economy. As Irene said, there's loads more on our website. I'm really happy to dive into that in the questions later. But what I want to share with you is what I think this man, Patrick Geddes, would say about a wellbeing economy if he were alive today. And I've been doing a bit of digging into some of his work and some of his insights. And I certainly think he's got a lot of wisdom to share with us today about how we might create a wellbeing economy. And this is what we might call the 7 PG tips. Now, my English tea drinking husband thinks that's hilarious, the PG tips, but I'm going to share with you these 7 tips that I've at least gleaned from looking over Patrick Geddes' life. And so the first is this idea of seeing the whole. You know, Geddes was took an interdisciplinary approach. He always highlighted the connections and the synergies between subject areas. And he's written, our greatest need today is to see life as a whole. We must have a practical and philosophical interest in an integrated view of life. And he talked about how, and he almost criticized how some of the specialist areas became, these are his words, too closely connected on his single specialism, too little awake to those of others. And this is really nicely critiquing this narrow mindset of going down rabbit holes and not seeing the whole system. And there's another of his points. In his writing, The Sociology of Autumn, he decries the behavior of American squirrel millionaires who scramble to store up more wealth than they consume. But he also predicts that the decay in community culture that led to such circumstances can actually be followed by different values in which resources are more equitably acquired, and I think that's a crucial word, and more equitably shared. It was almost like he was like Karl Polanyi before Karl Polanyi was writing about this double movement. Thirdly, and of course, Geddes was an ecologist who campaigned against local environmental pollution even before Glasgow's Hope Street started chopping the charts as the most polluted street. Geddes believed that gardens and green spaces were essential for encouraging people to be active outdoors, for producing local food, so local provisioning, for brightening up and improving the local environment, for community cohesion, for taking responsibility and stewardship for the local environment. And of course, he really campaigned for better understandings of people in those local environment. He didn't want to just focus on the individual. He said we had to see people in their natural built and social environments. He was really, in a way, talking about the social and environmental determinants, the causes of the causes, as Michael Marmot say today. Fourthly, he always talked about community involvement. He was a man of communal action. In 1884, he established the Environment Society, which encouraged locals to survey, to plan, to improve their local environment. And of course, his work in the Old Town in Edinburgh is an early example of redevelopment through active participation of residents. Fifthly, he had a contempt for examinations. And I like to think that that is because exams are really just a snapshot, a very narrow snapshot of the status of a person in a particular moment in time. And so that leads me to think I can't help hoping that he would have been a key advocate for better measures of progress at the macroeconomic level. Sixth is this idea of magnificent failures, which of course Geddes was well known for. And some people even describe Geddes himself as a magnificent failure. But I think this idea, this readiness to fail, takes us into the sort of necessary boldness and experimentation that is unconstrained by a narrow cognitive bandwidth that pushes us towards the usual recipes, the old orthodoxies that have failed us so patently in so many respects. And finally, he has a message about following your heart. He, of course, was drawn to nature studies when he was growing up, but he initially accepted a job working in a bank because that's what his parents wanted him to do. Fortunately, within just over a year, recognizing that he was unhappy working in a bank, he left banking and took up the sciences that he loved. But I think it's rather nice to know that he also married a rather cool-sounding woman, a woman called a musician called Anna Morton, and they worked together as a team to found the Edinburgh Social Union, and a lot of their work was really a team effort. So I'm going to dive into these 7 and just think about how these 7 PG tips, if you like, can help us create today the wellbeing economy in Scotland. So firstly, see the whole. Now this is a picture of my little nephew, and when he was 4, he went through that stage of always asking, but why, but why, but why? And I think this is the lesson here about see the whole. We need to look upstream. We need to not just be content to try and fix and treat the symptoms of an economic system that is doing so much damage to people and planet. We need to surf the silos rather than go down those rabbit holes and those blinkered perspectives. We need to see how things fit together and understand the ripple effects, seek out the potential for co-benefits. This is about requiring systems literacy of our practitioners, of our policymakers, and it's about saying expertise is not in a narrow sense or a reductionist approach that is so often taught at our universities. It's about really understanding the whole picture, as Geddes would say. And this image, I'm ashamed to say, comes from Melbourne, a town I spent my 20s in. This is apparently the most expensive cocktail it's possible to buy. It's rather interestingly called the Churchill. And I'm using it to illustrate just the extreme amount of economic inequality that Geddes himself so decried when he talked about the squirrel millionaires. And, you know, Scotland, we might think of ourselves as a more socially just orientated society, and yet this is a country where the 1% have as much wealth as the poorest 50% of the population. Since the GFC, globally, so much of the wealth that's been created in the last 10 years has gone to those at the very top. 7 out of 10 people, according to the World Inequality Report, live in countries where economic inequality prior to COVID was rising. And so inequalities and the era of the squirrel millionaires is truly back now, live and well. And I think this is a problem, and I suspect Geddes would recognize this, because of political capture and the inversion of power that that creates, but also because it is those at the very top, those who buy cocktails like the Churchill, it's their lifestyles who are doing the most pressure on the planet, who are doing most damage to our ecosystem. For example, the richest 10% globally have been accounted for about 50% of global CO2 emissions by consumption, so not by production. That takes into account offshoring, so huge damage. So we need to go beyond just looking at just redistribution. We need to look at, as Geddes would say, how wealth is acquired. So that's about pre-distribution. How do we set up the economy to create much more equal outcomes from the word go? How do we create our businesses? How do we pay people? How do we distribute through value share and ownership structures? And then how do we share? And that's a case of redistribution. We can come back to that in more detail in the Q&A, I hope. Geddes, of course, talked about how the importance of local matters. And this is really, I think, about the social and environmental determinants of health. He knew that people will not be healthy if they're surrounded by polluting industries and live in inadequate houses. And yet today, almost 100 years after his death, so many people still are blighted by inadequate housing and living next to polluting industries and having to suffer the damage to their health that creates. I think he would have recognised the environmental justice movement of today that reminds us of the overlay between socio-economic and environmental inequalities. And I think he would have had no truck with the individualization and narrow personal responsibility agenda that puts so much onus on individuals to survive, to adjust to be more resilient to an inhumane economic system that treats them as just-in-time inventory on demand at the click of an app, quite literally. And he'd know that we cannot keep telling people to toughen up and to become more employable, to be more resilient, when the context in which they live is keeping them down. Perhaps more positively, he recognised the importance of participation, and I think he would have loved the experiments we're seeing today in deliberative democracy, in participatory budgeting, in citizens' assemblies. I think he'd have been on my side when I say that our measures of progress need to be created through participatory processes rather than just having the views of elite imposing on citizens what they think is for their own good. I think he'd have worried about the inequalities that are inherent in so many fairly simple consultations, where the loudest voices get heard and where those who don't have spare time or resources can't afford to get involved. Or on the other hand, where people who have got the right connections don't even need to provide input to a consultation because they can just dial up their political friend and have a quiet word in their ear. And I think he'd understand that a well-being economy is about people feeling connected and in control, and that this requires all sorts of democratic scaffolding and all sorts of channels of engagement. And beyond examinations, Geddes said that some people, this is a lovely quote, I think, some people have strange ideas that they live by money. They think energy is generated by circulation of coins. But we live not by the jingling of our coins, but by the fullness of our harvests. And yet, what are our preeminent measures of progress today, beyond 100 years since Geddes died almost? It's calculations of how many coins we have. It's GDP, as we've seen this week. It's stock markets, it's consumer spending, it's productivity increases, it's real estate values. And I think if he were alive today, Geddes would have been at the forefront of the Beyond GDP movement. I think that he'd have recognised that to truly assess if our economy, locally or in the macro sense, is delivering human and ecological well-being, then we need to put those things that matter most at the top of the political pile and when we're holding decision makers to account. And Irene, this is for you. I think he'd have improved of my dream project to one day replace GDP with measures such as the number of girls who ride their bikes to school, because he would also recognise, taking into account of local context, if that number is going up, so many of the key drivers of collective well-being are in place. Almost there, this is the second to last one. Now, of course, his idea of magnificent failures, he kicked off over 20 social experiments in Edinburgh, all about improving health and housing. His embrace of experimentation and his readiness to fail is a good lesson. It helps us cast aside that stale embrace of practices that have run their course and open up our imaginations to the new practices that we need for economic system change, even though they might be messy and emergent. And I think he'd encourage us to look beyond narrow mindsets and conformity to apparently sensible or realistic ideas. I think instead he would encourage us to learn from the pioneers, to learn from people who are already building a wellbeing economy in their local area and actually contextualize them as having much more significance than beyond their individual project. Gaurav Perovitz, one of my intellectual heroes, describes such pioneering projects as the prehistory of a new economic era. And so finally, recognizing the extent to which Geddes soon cast aside those demands of his parents to go into banking and pursued the sciences that he loved, and recognizing too that he married a rather awesome woman who was his partner in so many of his professional pursuits, reminds us that he lived his life according to his passions rather than what society or narrow orthodoxy expected of him. And yet today, our economic system is one where the social dynamics that spawns pushes people away from their true calling, away from what is most important to them. And I think Geddes would be saddened today to see that with all our knowledge, with all our science, with all our history to learn from, so many people don't live the lives they want to. And just to give you an illustration of that, this is something that we talk about in the book. This is an Australian palliative care nurse, Bronnie Weir, who with her work through decades with people who are in their last days documented some of their common regrets. And it's things like, I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself. I wish I hadn't worked so hard. And she describes that as coming from every single male patient that she worked with. I wish I had the courage to express my feelings. I wish I'd stayed in touch with my friends. And I wish I had let myself be happier. I think Geddes would take this into account and take into account the disconnect between the economic system we have and the economic system that we really need, and embrace and celebrate the wellbeing economy agenda as one that helps put things like relationships, work-life balance, and authenticity at its heart. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Katherine, for all those words. Loved your reference. You know how much I value and use that reference to create an environment that I think it's been always a 12-year-old girl can cycle to school. If it's suited to that happening, then you've built the kind of place that is going to deliver far more well-being, i.e. people and planetary health for everybody. And certainly, as I'm always there with planning and place in my mind, then I always find it a very good way to capture it. And I sense check it with a lot of things that are going on and think, no, it would fit here as well. It would definitely fit. So thank you so much. I wonder within that, Craig McLaren is going to, if anybody has any questions, then if you can, as I say, put them in that questions box and Craig will be in touch with me. I'm just checking how he's getting in touch with me because I haven't actually heard from him. So, but could I ask you, since I'm here and sharing it, can I ask that first question around, we have the National Performance Framework, which when I first attended the launch of it, I think in 2018, I was really delighted to see well-being actually featured in that central statement before growth. Growth was still there, unfortunately, but well-being was there. How would you like to see that performance framework shape up now, given even more so where we are about this need for a new normal and how this pandemic has highlighted the inequalities? What's the kind of change that you would like to be seeing?
So that 2018 is a revision on the previous version, of course, and I think it's a huge improvement thanks to the work of a wide range of organisations that had been pointing out the extent to which that fairly narrow focus on increasing GDP growth just wasn't delivering the sort of society that we needed in Scotland. So there was a great community of effort that led to the eventual revision of the National Performance Framework. And it is fantastic to have wellbeing and things like kindness is at the very forefront of that, and to really see the different dimensions that I think cast a wider net in terms of what the purpose of society, the economy, and the role of government is about. I don't think it's there yet, because I do think it reflects the fact that we're not yet ready to step away from seeing growth as the preeminent means to fixing all our problems. And we're going to see, I mean, this week of all week with the GDP figures out, we've been so forced into this mindset that if we increase growth, that will lead to decent jobs, that will lead to better quality of lives for people, and it will improve the environment. And yet the evidence doesn't stack up anymore. In rich countries like the UK and like Scotland, there's a growing disconnect between GDP growth and what actually really matters to people. We've seen over the last few decades, health inequalities rising, suicide rates rising in the last few years, problems with the environment in an era of growing GDP. So we can no longer rely on it. It's an old recipe, an outdated recipe, and certainly not fit for an era where we're recognising, I hope in Scotland, the science around the planetary boundaries, and we just cannot keep pushing our economy beyond its limits. And the unfortunate reality is that any claims of decoupling GDP growth from environmental impacts have proved inadequate, too slow, and not in the extent to which we need to. So I think we've got to reach for new solutions, and that's challenging because it requires a fundamental rethink of the economic system. It's not just about tweaking around the edges as we've done for the last few decades. It's about repurposing our economic system. And it's about, as I said earlier, it's about pre-distributing the wealth rather than waiting till after the fact and to rely on social policy and charity to fix some of those demands. And so to me, the third version of the NPF 3.0, would be one that really recognized it's not about growth in an abstract sense. It's about what do we need more of, in what areas, and how do we create that? Because growth in itself is an abstract term. GDP is a measure that's bound up with a whole lot of perverse incentives. I was saying to a colleague the other day, it takes the good, the bad, and the ugly, puts them all together and calls it great. We can be much more sophisticated about what we need more of in Scotland. So to me, the next iteration of the NPF has to be about saying it's about the ultimate goal is about a wellbeing economy. What are the drivers of that, and flipping that means and ends around in a more appropriate order.
Thank you. I think there's quite a role here for, we have a national planning framework within planning, and what we see it as now, was previously it was very much about delivering the right environment for growth, just as you've been saying. But now what is coming through is a whole set of additional outcomes. Growth is still in there and it has different adjectives in front of it, but it has additional outcomes about health, about health, about the planet, about biodiversity. This is like trying to remember the 7 dwarfs and get them all. Inequality as well, rural depopulation, and housing. And I certainly welcome that as the sort of the spatial iteration of what the national performance outcomes are about. And as we review our national planning framework and how planning is contributing, I think it's really worth keeping in mind that, yeah, that was a 2018 document, and we would be hoping with the economic advisory group that Scottish Government have pulled together to look at that new normal, that it may be influencing a new kind of national set of indicators.
And I think it's an important shift from, for so long we've seen the business case for growth, as I describe it. So you'd have groups like the IMF, for example, saying, well, we need to reduce gender inequality because that's a brake on growth, or we need to reduce poverty because that's bad for growth. We need to reduce inequality because it harms growth. I mean, what an extraordinary order of priorities, that gender inequality, poverty, and reducing inequality were seen as bad for growth. And what we need to really do is ask again, what sort of growth, in what circumstances, for those higher order goals. That is quite a shift from what we've been attuned to date. And that's why I love that idea of the magnificent failures and being ready for experimentation and casting off that orthodoxy of the last few decades. And because this will be difficult, because it's a whole system change. It's no longer enough just to polish the edges. But I think there's lots of good stuff happening in Scotland, and I do think the NPF and the National Planning Framework are certainly potentially some world leading examples that, if not perfect, we can certainly build on.
I've got a question asking about, with such wealth inequality, do you think in a well-being economy you would need to put in place a maximum income?
It's something I'd absolutely want to talk about. I'd hesitate away from Katherine deciding what it should be, but I think that's something we absolutely need a discussion about. There's been some really interesting work about when the tail off of the benefit of more individual wealth happens, and also that the equivalent of that at the macroeconomic level. And there's also been some really interesting work around the extent of political capture, and at what point does a certain amount of wealth become problematic. There's also challenges around how so much wealth is created. So globally, there are just over 2,000 billionaires in the world, and former colleagues of mine in Oxfam US did some analysis of how did those billionaires get their wealth, and a third of them is through their entrepreneurial activity. So creating something really great. But we need to be cognizant of the role of society and public institutions in creating wealth as well. But for the other remaining 2/3, the 2/3 of that wealth comes from inheritance or from being linked to industries that are associated with crony capitalism or monopolies. And so it's this idea of these extraordinary creative people who are massively more talented than the rest of us, who deserve that wealth. It's something we need to have a conversation about and raise an eyebrow about and think about. Actually, maybe that we need to recognize a societal role in that. And I think that also takes us into the terrain of a conversation we need right now around windfall taxes, because particularly now in that there are so many industries that are struggling, but there will be also other industries that are doing relatively well in the corona crisis, and asking them to chip in to the societal response to corona, I think is a vital conversation. And I think Scotland's really good. In Scotland, we're talking about conditions on receiving public funds and public bailouts associated with environmental performance, of course, saying we're not going to give public funds to business activities associated with tax havens. That's just the sort of conversation we need. It needs to be all about conditionality.
And there's that aspect of those big anchor institutions in Scotland being, NHS, councils, and what they can be doing with the support they give, but again with conditions, and again thinking about their procurement and how they're helping build economies and more local economies as well, and that community wealth building as well.
Yeah, I have a fantasy that the procurement officers will be the heroes of bringing in a wellbeing economy, because procurement is such an important lever. Procurement and planning, I think, are two levers that haven't been used enough in really shaping our local economies, the sort of business ecosystems, the sort of businesses we want to be operating in our local towns and in the Scottish economy, and using procurement and planning to really bring into the fore things like cooperatives, social enterprises, the whole suite of pro-social businesses that we know are using business activities, but to deliver social and environmental returns at the same time. So it's not by any means an anti-business, it's saying absolutely businesses, but these are the ones that really we know benefit people and planet.
Yeah, so because we have a question about, how do you think we can experiment safely? Now, perhaps that is the sort of areas where there are already those out there doing that and looking at things like basic income and looking at procurement. And, we are aware of some organisations that are already doing that.
I mean, I think basic income is something to just give people this cushion that they can take a bit of a leap. I think it links, of course, to the operation of our welfare system. So the extent to which, this flexicurity agenda that we see in places like Denmark, where people are able to move jobs because they know they don't need to leave a job or perhaps even start up a new one, because they know their out of work benefits will not push them below the poverty line. So giving people that security. But more generally, in terms of initiatives, I think there's a really important role for our collective institutions in underwriting community solutions. And I see so many examples of fantastic communities who understand their locality, who understand what the challenges are, who've got amazing ideas, who just need a bit of underwriting to experiment, to try it out, to adjust, to reflect and to refine, if we could give them the sort of long-term support and backing. as society, as we do with so many big pieces of infrastructure or big investments. We need the micro version of that as well to really underwrite community solutions. And there are some examples of programs like that I'd love to see them more rolled out in Scotland, so that communities who have got these ideas can just roll up their sleeves and go about creating these experiments.
It is. It's that the whole systems approach to how we're working and assisting with communities, and it makes me think about the place principle that a lot of us have heard of, where we're asked to work with other stakeholders and communities in looking at what is happening in a place and moving forward, and not always sitting going, we're getting on with our job, we're in our silo, thank you very much. Because it's messy, isn't it, when you step out?
It's messy and it's emergent, and there are differences of opinions, but so, I mean, the lessons from deliberative democracy are just so clear, that when you give people the chance and the space to sit down together and to talk and to listen and reflect, then you do come to good ideas, to useful consensus. But it's about creating the spaces in the right tone and recognizing, as I said earlier, the barriers to participating there. So paying for childcare, recognizing that 2 hours out of someone's week is a big chunk of time if they're living on the breadline. So perhaps recognizing that time through some way. And I think, again, in Scotland, there are good examples of that emerging, citizens' assemblies being a classic example, but other examples. And so I think there is a lot of literature and scholarship and evidence in the deliberative democracy field that we can draw on and take heart from.
Question about the Academy of Economics. How can we encourage them to do more research into other perspectives beyond the current ones around the economy?
And I'm guessing you don't know who's saying these questions, do you? I'd be really curious. I don't know if it's people I know or not.
I have a name, John Gillis.
All right, hi John. That's a lovely coincidence, just when I asked. I think in terms of changing the economics curricula, I think the first step is to listen to the students, because for a long time, young economics scholars have been coming out of their classrooms and protesting and saying to their lecturers and their professors, stop teaching us this economics curricula that bears no resemblance to the real world. And so one of the members of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance that we're really proud to work with is a group, Rethinking Economics, made up of young people who are starting to recreate economics curricula, who are really lobbying for change. And there's all sorts of variations of that organisation now. So there's a lot of movement now to create economics that's much more aligned with reality. It's not about doing away with economics, and it's also too about broadening the lens. There have been economics scholars for decades who have been writing about these things. Ecological economists, feminist economists, for so long have already been pointing out the inadequacy. It's just that we've narrowed the spotlight onto a very small type of classic economic literature where we assume away so many of the important things and dismiss them as externalities. But John, my first recommendation would be start with the students. And at Edinburgh, you're lucky because there were some really great students through the Economic Change Unit who we work with, and they're amazing young people. So they're on your doorstep at Edinburgh University.
Cool. Another one around growth, which I think feeds on what you've just been saying there, that it's not saying that all growth is bad, it's just that sometimes it's not the most appropriate approach. So does a new economy that involves less growth or using growth in different ways, so is it actually having less growth or just using it differently? I'd imagine it's a bit of
it's a bit of both. I mean, it's recognizing that in rich countries like the UK, growth has in a way done its job in the terms that we have so much wealth and resources. And if you look at all sorts of channels, and if I'd had longer, I would have included these slides because I often include them in presentations that point to the diminishing marginal returns of more and more growth as measured by GDP, that the benefits in terms of social progress measured by things like life expectancy or poverty reduction or literacy rates, they're very clear rises at early stages of economic development. But after a certain point, they start to tail off. And then there's an argument, and I think I'm quite sympathetic to it, that actually what starts to overwhelm the expenditure on growth is dealing with what we describe as failure demand in social policy terms, or defensive expenditure, as ecological economists would describe it. And I think part of the challenge is that the way we measure growth through GDPs, there's so many perverse incentives bound up with GDP. I mean, it counts as good cleaning up after an oil spill. It counts as good our spending on after car crashes or divorces and so on. There's perverse incentives. It's also hopeless at encouraging prevention. So if we're good as a society at keeping people safe and healthy, GDP may actually go down. So we need to grapple with that in a way GDP rewards that downstream, acute, expensive, reactive expenditure that which has been so much of the terrain of social and economic policy. So we need to really grapple with finding a measure of progress that's fit for purpose. And I mean, there's a nice symmetry in that after the Great Recession in the 1920s and 30s, when in the US, Roosevelt brought in the New Deal, that's when GDP emerged. And part of the rationale for creating GDP was to measure the impact on the economy of the New Deal. So now, pretty much 100 years on, in a new era where we're recognizing the existence and reality of planetary boundaries, where we've got the goals of the SDGs and the NPF here in Scotland, we need a new measure of progress, not one that emerged 100 years ago for 100-year-ago circumstances, and hence the idea of things like the number of girls that ride their bikes to school, or something like the genuine progress or the social progress indicator, something that is much better closely aligned and isn't bound up with those perverse incentives. So it's not about no growth carte blanche, because that's an abstract term, but it's about saying, what do we really need to help people live good lives in their communities right now?
Just reading another question here. What are the ways are there to transition to a wellbeing economy? Is there a role for national pilots on doing that? Now, I'm aware that some areas of Scotland are piloting things like basic income and community wealth building.
But in the macro sense, if I understand the question correctly, I mean, the challenge is there is no country around the world that delivers this perfectly. And there's research that encourage folks to look at from scholars at the University of Leeds that looked around the world for an economy, and in a macro national sense. So this sort of averages out all sorts of inherent internal inequalities. So that's a big caveat. But in a macro sense, they looked for a national economy that lifted people above a social foundation, so delivered on basic social needs, but did so without putting excess pressure on the planet, without breaching those planetary boundaries. And the bad news is that they found no country that was delivering that. So there were GDP rich countries that were, in an average sense, lifting their citizens above a social foundation, but were doing so while putting huge pressure on the planet. And then vice versa, there were lower GDP income countries who were not putting so much pressure on the planet, but were also not lifting their citizens above the social floor, which to me, that is the benchmark. What it shows is that we are in new terrain. We need to be so creative in really unpacking and reimagining our economic systems, because there's no blueprint. There are hints of possibilities though. And so in the book, for example, we talk about Japan as a country that hasn't had GDP growth for a few decades and has been desperately trying to squeeze more GDP growth out of the economy. And that's come with all sorts of work-life pressures and so on. But in other domains, in terms of life expectancy and health, Japan is doing fine without GDP growth. And then you can look at a country like Costa Rica that's middle income status, and they've just joined the OECD, so they're sort of upper middle income status. They have created high life expectancy, high levels of education, high quality of life as measured by some of the subjective measures, amazing levels of biodiversity without an enormous GDP per capita. So there are hints of possibility, if not perfection yet. And I do think Scotland is a really good place to embrace this. And I'm really proud that Scotland has teamed up with some other national governments around the world, like New Zealand and Iceland and Wales, to create the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership. Because We Go is all about learning from each other and experimenting and sharing lessons and sharing common concerns in putting the wellbeing economy agenda really into policy making, making change for citizens accordingly.
Completely agree. And I think in Scotland as well, we have the Infrastructure Commission, which is coming forward with looking at things like housing as infrastructure. We cannot help and reduce inequality if we don't address the lack of affordable housing through actually at times just providing public sector housing is the most direct way to do it. And it actually then at the end it gives an income back to councils who are you know, cash strapped. So there are aspects within that. And then I wonder also about with the new investment bank and its priorities. I know that it talks about having a place mission, and I wonder what your thoughts are on what it could be investing in.
So let me just respond to the housing point too. I think it's a really, really good example because to date and in recent years, housing has been used by so many as a source of investment rental. So we've seen it as a financial asset rather than a home. And I often think we talk about house price rises. No one talks about home price rises. We've shifted our mindset away from seeing houses as our homes where we look after each other, where we feel safe and secure, to seeing them as a source of rent, literally economic rents. And part of the reason why wealth inequalities have got so high in places like Scotland and the UK is because of that exacerbation of economic rents going to those at the very top. So we have to, the housing system is a huge lever of change, so let alone provisioning in terms of basic needs for people, in terms of shelter, but also undermining those drivers of financial and wealth inequalities that housing's been part of. In terms of the National Investment Bank and the SNIB, I mean, I think it's a great, it's fantastic Scotland's got it. I think we all need to keep a weather eye on their values and principles and where the investment goes, because what we should be using is an investment bank to really pump prime green infrastructure, shifting to the sort of housing, maybe supporting co-housing, where we share white goods and you know, infrastructure and so on, absolutely for the whole lot of work that is required to shift the Green New Deal. And we should be using it, again, perhaps to underwrite community solutions, as we were talking about earlier. I think we should also be using it to put that conditionality on the support that they give to businesses around what sort of business is this, what are their supply chains, is it worker owned, for example, how does it distribute the value between workers and the owners of the business? Even better if the workers own it. So I think there's a lot of questions that we should be asking about how that money gets deployed and who it goes for. But I think it's a bit of a watch this space at the moment. I think we're just starting to see the SNIB gear into action. But I think everyone should really keep an eye on it and be prepared to call it out if it's not aligning its investment with the sort of things we need more of in a wellbeing economy for Scotland.
Mm-hmm. Final, I think, question that I've really got time for, I'm afraid, is can local economic initiatives such as community wellbeing help us move forward with the wellbeing economy? What are your thoughts around community wealth building initiatives? Because that's something that is actually on the ground happening here and there.
Absolutely, and of course in North Ayrshire, I mean, they launched just a few weeks ago. I'm really, really proud to be part of that work and supporting them, because I think community wealth building is a crucial piece of the jigsaw of the sort of shift and the sort of activities we need for a wellbeing economy. In my mind, to create a wellbeing economy, it is like one of those 1,000, 2,000 piece jigsaws. There's a lot of changes we need at all levels of the system, right up from our measures of progress like GDP, right through to how we design our taxes, what sort of infrastructure we build, what sort of businesses do we create, right through to local changes and small community initiatives and practices. And I do think community wealth building is a really significant, crucial, non-negotiable part of just reimagining what economic flows are about locally, being much more ambitious in terms of local economic multipliers and asking more of that money that's going to get spent anyway through, as you referred to earlier, anchor organisations were saying, well, let's hang on a minute. Can't we do better with this? And that mantra and that mindset of co-benefits or even triple benefits, I think something we could roll out to other practices as well. So it's asking a few questions before pressing the go button. You know, could we do this better? Could we squeeze a bit more of the juice out of something we're going to have to do anyway? And I think community wealth building is really fantastic, and applaud all the work that's being done already in Scotland, because the world is watching Scotland in so many ways. And the community wealth building agenda is one example of that.
Yeah, and I think what you say about, you know, it is a complex system. It takes so many little bits to build it all up. And for myself, that's where I see, you know, that role of place is just part of that system, but we have to see our role in it, because if everybody felt, oh, I I can't solve it on my own. None of us can. This is something that takes us all having our input into it.
What's really great about things happening locally, those pioneering examples that I showed that slide about, I think Geddes would really pile in on the pioneering examples. What really matters about them is, yes, their own delivery, but what they also do is they're of heightened significance because they demonstrate feasibility and desirability of something different. They are little wellbeing economy examples in microcosm. So they're loaded with importance beyond the initial initiative themselves. They are pioneers of a wellbeing economy, and we'll only see that in our local places. That's where people start to understand this sense of possibility. This isn't a step into the unknown, because we see it in microcosm.
I love that, pioneers of local places. And I honestly feel that, every time there's a change in a place and planners are sitting there assessing it, I'd love everyone to be seeing ourselves as every time you're a small pioneer of that place and what it's like to live in that place and to function in that place, and then the impact that accumulates up into what is a different way of assessing the success of a country, really, isn't it? I'm afraid we've got loads more questions, but not enough time. So
people can tweet them to me or share them with me, and perhaps then I can try and answer them on Twitter or something.
Will do, and I know that we've agreed we'll do a little blog after this, so we could see if we could address some of them in that as well. What I want to do at the moment is we always at the end of the Geddes lecture have a vote of thanks. And Sue Manns, as I said earlier, is here. She's president of RTPI UK. So I'm going to pass over to Sue to give her vote of thanks, and then I shall close up with what we've got to finish up with around Katherine and I responding to some of those other questions. Sue, over to you.
Thank you very much, and a huge thank you to you, Irene, to Katherine, and to everyone for inviting me to join this lecture. I've been left buzzing. There is so much going around in my mind based on what you've said. And I'm speaking from a wet Staffordshire, where wet and cold, where people want to be indoors. They don't want to be outside. But you have actually got you've had 235 people listening to this session. And I remember before it went on air, Katherine, Irene and myself were talking, and Katherine, you made the point that often you only get, when people do these sessions, not you personally, but generally, an attendance of 50%. Well, you actually achieved 96%, which is incredible from those who'd registered. That really is amazing. And the fact that only 1 or 2 have dropped out during the session is an incredible testament to what you had to say and the messages that you've shared with us. So thank you so much for that. And say, I'm buzzing. There are phrases that I'm going to go away with and questions that I'm going to go away with, like, what do we actually want from economic growth? What sort of society are we aiming for? And that wonderful phrase that's now going to become a key phrase, isn't it? Pioneers of local places. So there really has been so much in what you've said. And I think it's great, the resources that you've mentioned on your website. I think I'd really commend those to everybody if you get a chance to have a look at them. But also, if you get a chance to read Katherine's book, The Economics of Arrival. I think, as you said, there's quite a lot there that actually you've built from today, and it's a great thing to go back and have a look at. And I was privileged to have a look at your book a few days ago, and those messages from Bronnie Ware that you mentioned, they're still buzzing around in my head. What do we really want our legacy to be? What is special? What is important? And I think there are so many questions and so many different ways that we can bring together answers and hopefully create those better places. So on behalf of everybody, thank you, Katherine, so much for doing today's Patrick Geddes lecture. It really is very, very special. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue, my pleasure. And thank you to everyone who did stay on despite the sun or the rain, wherever you are. It's been a delight talking with you. We'll try and pick up those questions later. I'm
sure anybody that dropped away was simply because they lost their internet connection. There couldn't have been any other reason for it.
It was minute. There were virtually nobody who went. It's quite phenomenal.
There's a number of people who can't stand Australian accents, so we can put it down to that.
Okay. It's fantastic to be the audience.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks, Sue, for your thanks, and also to Jenny for organising us today, and Craig for forwarding on those questions, but mostly to everybody who has attended today. For those that couldn't manage to, we have a recording of the session so folks can watch it. Again, so much, you know, previous Geddes lectures have been about 100 people in either Edinburgh or Glasgow, so very Central Belt focused. The beauty again of what is happening right now, and what is a very sad period for people, but there's always that element of a brighter side to it, is that we're learning to be much more equal in how we can reach out geographically across Scotland and beyond with our messages as an organisation and in our meetings as well. And I think that's been a fantastic part of today, that we've been able to do that and reach a far bigger number of people also. So that recording is there. Katherine very kindly agreed that we would do a blog together, but we would wait until we had completed this and then have a think about that afterwards. So also look out for that. We'll both be tweeting about it at that point. And I can't emphasize enough, please do go and have a look at Katherine's website and at the Wellbeing Economy website as well, because there's just such a great array of resources there, that no matter what angle you're here listening in today, you'll find something that gives you that little hook in. You go, oh, that's the bit that I can make a difference on. Planning and place is about, you know, managing that use of land in the long-term public interest, and that's exactly what we've been here talking about today. So thank you, everyone. That's exactly bang on 5 o'clock. So I'm not sure, the sun's gone away in Edinburgh, but off you go, everybody, and enjoy. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you so much.